welcome to the Dean Abbott podcast. Here we talk about all the aspects of creating a more peaceful, livable, and quieter life for ourselves, with a special focus on developing a quieter mind, quieter relationships, and quieter lifestyles. If you have a question for me or you want to respond to anything you hear on the show, you can find me on Twitter, where my handle is @DeanAbbott, or you can just email me at dean@deanabbott.com. You should also know that this podcast is only one of two that I'm currently producing. The other is called Plain Spoken, and it's a solo podcast where I produce it on a regular basis to just sit down and give my take on the issues of life. People often ask me where I learned the things I know. They want to know if I read a certain book or a certain set of books or someone taught me. Well, in this episode, I had the chance to sit down with someone from whom I have learned a tremendous amount, someone to whom I'm very grateful, and someone I'm very excited to introduce to you. She goes online by the moniker The Little Shaman, and she's a narcissistic abuse coach and runs littleshaman.org, where she offers many different resources to help people in unhealthy relationships or who are struggling with other kinds of problems. Her YouTube channel, where she posts videos and podcasts on these topics, currently has about 63,000 subscribers, and it ought to have a whole lot more. I hope you benefit from her words as much as I have. Well, thank you for talking with me today.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about what you do and how you came to, well, really be on the podcast, because obviously I found you because of your material on narcissism, but for somebody who doesn't know you at all, how would you explain what you're all about?
Mostly I am known for my teachings regarding pathological narcissism and just kind of healing in general, but healing from trauma, healing from abuse. The word I probably would use to define myself most of all would be teacher, but also some people use coach. You know, I have a podcast on YouTube and Spotify and all those things, mostly about what pathological narcissism is, how does it affect people, why do these people behave this way? And also I work with people one-on-one. I do clinics and seminars and workshops, teaching tools to people who are dealing with trauma and abuse.
And how did you learn all this that you know?
Oh, that's a long road, right?
What's the short answer?
Well, mostly it was through my own experience. I was married to a diagnosed narcissist for almost 20 years. And, then after learning things, I look back and realize I've had several of these relationships. There are some people in my family. So if you want a really short answer, someone said to me one time that true knowledge is a combination of experience, information, and education. So I just happen to have some of all of those.
Great. So narcissists, we call them narcissists because we get that word from the myth of Narcissus, a handsome young man who fell in love with his own reflection and was so beguiled by it that he would not leave it until basically he died, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So that's the mythological origin, but how would you define a narcissist for somebody who is unfamiliar with what that is and in kind of modern parlance?
Well, and we can get really into the weeds in here about what is really a narcissist, but they generally show up as people who are really, really selfish. And, it's beyond the normal experience with selfishness. This is somebody who is really able to make every single thing about them, everything. This is someone who is unable to take responsibility for things. They may, sometimes if they're really narcissistic, they can appear almost delusional, and they say things that didn't happen. This is with gaslighting. I'm sure you've heard that. People are very familiar with that term now, where they insist things happen that did not happen, or insist that things did not happen when they did. They will often accuse people of saying or doing things that they didn't do. Excuse me. Essentially, the selfishness and the inability really to connect or get to know people. For example, when I was married to a narcissist for, when we had been married 17 years, he did not know my favorite color. And he really didn't know. Like, it wasn't like he was just trying to be a smart aleck or be mean. He really didn't know what it was. And so these are people who are they're self-focused and self-absorbed, really, to the point of the exclusion of literally everything. I mean, the selfishness is really, even after you've known one for maybe 15 years or 10 years, the selfishness can still shock you.
Now,
That's
a lot
really
of times,
a defining characteristic. I'm sorry.
No, it's sometimes when people hear the word narcissist, I've seen people say, well, that word is bandied about too much, right? And that it just means, people use it to mean just someone who thinks highly of themselves. How is what you're talking about different from someone who just thinks highly of themselves?
Well, and that can be maybe a way that it can manifest. For example, there are some narcissistic people who sort of try to project this image of, that, as we would say, like, they're all that, right? They have a great this, they're a wonderful this. But someone who thinks highly of themselves, if someone has true high self-esteem, usually is a pretty balanced person. They're okay with themselves. They're pretty happy with who they are. Narcissists are the opposite of that. They're not happy with who they are. That is an act. So, and then there are also, of course, some that don't act that way at all. There are some that are very vulnerable. They seem very sort of down on themselves, or they're always a victim, or, nothing ever works out for them. But someone who just has a high opinion of themselves, I mean, this is so much more than that. Excuse me. People with serious narcissistic pathology are essentially developmentally, like, stunted. They have arrested development, and they have a lot of challenges. I mean, this is a lot more than just a behavioral problem. Excuse me. Or an emotional problem, or a cognition problem, or a perception problem. It's all of these things, but it's also more than that. This is a personality dysfunction or disorder, where every single aspect, everything this person thinks, does, says, perceives, hears, all of it is affected by this. So it really is. One of the things I tell people is, because sometimes people will say, well, I'm not sure if someone's a narcissist or not. One of the biggest red flags, or sort of keys, that you will have, that you will find, I guess we could say, is that after you've spent any amount of time with this person, you will really start to get the sense that, something's wrong. And if you're around somebody who just thinks highly of themselves, you might think, well, geez, their ego is huge, but you wouldn't think something's wrong with them. And so that is probably the biggest red flag, is that you just kind of feel like, okay, something's not right here. This is not right. The way that this person behaves, or the way that they're receiving things that I'm saying, and blah, 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 something's just off. And that is usually one of the things that starts people toward trying to figure out. That's how they find, the word narcissist and start learning about this, is because what's going on is it's beyond normal selfishness. It's beyond normal just thinking highly of yourself or having low self-esteem. It's way beyond these things.
Yeah, I want to try to distinguish this a little bit, because it's important to, I think, people understand that when you're talking about someone who's truly narcissistic, it's not just a matter of degree. It's not just they have very high self-esteem. It's something much more fundamentally problematic than that.
Yes.
And you touched on it, and I think it's helpful to people to distinguish between kind of the grandiose narcissist, the look at me, I'm awesome, people who might talk and sound delusional about what they are able to do or who they are. I remember talking to a guy who was a therapist once, and he said, A good example of a narcissist is somebody who thinks, well, I could go down there to the martial arts studio and I could probably whip all those guys. They might be black belts, whatever, but they're not going to stand up to me, right? That's your grandiose narcissist. And then you mentioned vulnerable, right? So there's also this thing called the covert or vulnerable narcissist, who does the opposite and says, I'm worthless. I need all your attention because I'm worthless, or something like that. And I just don't want the listener to think that only grandiosity is a sign of narcissism.
Absolutely. And the way to look at that is to remember that that is sort of grandiosity too. If I'm not the best, I'm the worst. Right.
Right.
And so in a way that's grandiosity too. It's just not the normal connotation we sort of see around that word, because if we think of grandiosity as in with these big giant ideas about all these things that you think you can do that are not really realistic, the example you gave is a really good one. Or for example, they think that by doing something that they're doing, they're going to change the world, and there's nothing wrong with that, but the way that they look at it is really, really sort of pie in the sky, almost like cartoonish in a way.
Right.
And so excuse me, the opposite grandiosity, where I'm the worst, I'm the most horrible thing that ever lived, I'm worthless type of thing, that's grandiosity as well. It's just that we don't recognize it. So, but I know what you're saying. Covert narcissists often are in my opinion, they're more dangerous and they're much more difficult to see. Because, for example, if someone comes at you with a giant ego, okay, that's not hard to see. With an obviously giant ego, I guess I should say, because vulnerable narcissists also have an ego that's very large, but it doesn't manifest the same way that we're talking about. And so it's like, with a vulnerable narcissist, they can come across as very needy. They can seem very vulnerable. They often sort of purport themselves as really, really insecure, or they can be sort of like a hero personality, very magnanimous, very generous. The word covert means hidden. And so anytime that it's not blatantly in your face, abusive, arrogant, egotistical, then that is someone we would consider to be more covert, because it's not obvious at all. And that's very hard for people to see. You know, I speak with people who the person in their life is covertly narcissistic, and it took them years and years to understand and figure it out. And that's actually what, in part of the situation that I was dealing with in my personal life, that was part of how it went. Because everything, especially at that time, you know, now you can sort of type into Google and it'll come right up, but it wasn't like that, you know, 20 years ago or 25 years ago, however long ago this was. And so, excuse me, the symptoms that you find, or the clinical criteria, really does sort of encapsulate overt narcissism. And if somebody doesn't act like that, it seems like it doesn't fit.
Exactly right. That's part of the problem with kind of the DSM criteria for narcissism, is that they do sort of only tend to capture the grandiosity or the grandiose narcissist, and they leave out the covert one. Another misconception a lot of people have is that all narcissists are men, and that's not true, is it?
No, that's not true. And that is, for me personally, professionally, just in general, I've sort of seen that it seems to be about 50-50. Because I always tell people, look, pathological narcissism doesn't discriminate. It can happen to people of any sex, any gender, any ethnicity, any race, any class standing, like literally, you know, I speak to people all over the world. And so it's unfortunately something that it like I said, it doesn't discriminate. It's very unfortunate, but specifically speaking to that, there are 4 different cluster B personality disorders, and there are the first 2 which deal with more sort of emotionally explosive types of symptomology or manifestation, are disproportionately assigned to women. It's about 75%. And the second two, which deal more with sort of what we consider to be interpersonally exploitative behavior, maybe violence, those are disproportionately sort of assigned to men. So in my opinion, the disproportionate way that this has turned out really warrants more investigation. That's my opinion, because I think that there may be some sort of cultural or gender bias here where we say this behavior is what we see more in women, so this must be women. And so or this behavior is what we see more in men, so this must be men. You know, for example, many times a woman has to be really, really violent in order to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder or as a psychopath, whereas that's not true for men. Men do not have to be violent in order to be diagnosed as a psychopath.
I suspect that because the DSM criteria focus so much on capturing grandiose narcissism, that accounts also for its disproportionate diagnosis among men. And that
Yes.
my hypothesis is that women tend to be more on the covert end. Female narcissists tend to be on the more covert end.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also think that it's a shame that it has sort of shaken out that way because, for example, if you have a man who is more covert or who is more emotional and more sort of with the emotional explosiveness or manifestations, they're not recognized as having one of those two disorders. I mean, it's, you know, it's very difficult for them to get that diagnosis sometimes. That's why it's, you know, 75% of people diagnosed with this are women, not men. So that's, you know.
Sure. So let's talk about narcissism in relationships and what it looks like. Mm-hmm. I have a few ideas I want to talk about, but what would you say, 2 or 3 things that really are red flags that if you're in the relationship and this is happening, you need to seriously consider whether or not you're dealing with a narcissist?
If you find that when you're trying to communicate with this person, everything is turned around on you. They cannot take accountability. They can't take responsibility. They're constantly, we call it, you know, twisting things. They're constantly twisting things around on you. Everything becomes about what you have done. That's a huge red flag, because one of the defining characteristics of relationships with narcissists is that they don't go anywhere. It's just constantly running on this treadmill like a hamster wheel, right? Where you're relitigating the same things over and over and over, and there's no end to it. They will accept no explanation. They will take no apology. That's even if you actually did something wrong, you know? And another thing is if you find yourself having to explain basic concepts of communication or respect or communication to somebody that is a grown adult, you know, that is not something that you should be having to do, and you especially should not have to be doing it more than once.
Right.
Because, you know, if you're saying to somebody, hey, the way you're speaking to me is not respectful, because it's not respectful to call someone names or get up and walk away right in the middle of when they're talking. Or when I say one thing, you jump into the conversation. You didn't even hear what I had to say. You're already telling me I'm wrong, or you're already trying to contradict me. If you say that to somebody one time and they still keep doing it, I mean, you know, so you really have to think about that. Those are two of the two biggest things, because those are fundamental things. And that's something that I really, you know, I wish people understood more, is that this is not, if you're dealing with someone who is truly pathologically narcissistic, this is not a communication problem. It's not a marriage problem. You know, this is a mental health problem, and it's not your mental health problem. So there's nothing you can do about it.
Right. So a couple of examples. You're in a relationship with someone and you say to them, well, why did you throw my favorite shirt in the trash? A normal person is going to say, it had a hole in it, right? Or I burned it while I was ironing. The narcissist is going to say, what are you talking about? 2 years ago, I asked you to stop at the store and get milk, and you didn't bring it home.
That's exactly right. Or they'll say, well, you said you didn't want it anymore. And so I remember that you said that and I threw it away. I was trying to do something nice. It's all that kind of thing where no matter how you bring it up, I liken it to when people are playing tennis and the ball comes over and they just hit it back. They're not even really looking at it. Doesn't matter. It's just, nope. I'm not talking about this. This is you. This is all you.
And so when they say, well, I threw it out because I was trying to do something nice, and now you're hurting me because I did something nice in throwing out your favorite shirt. Right?
That's exactly right.
There's another step.
And because it's the entire thing, no matter how they say it, no matter how they twist it, no matter how they deflect or deny, the whole thing is designed to get you to stop talking about this. They don't want you to talk about this.
The one of the things that I think, and you sort of touched on this, that defines being in a relationship with a narcissist is almost what I kind of casually call a kind of psychosis light, right? Where you're trying to talk to this person and their responses indicate a disconnect from reality. And I don't think it's it's not really psychotic in that they don't seem to like entirely believe it themselves the way a person who's truly psychotic is totally into that delusion. But they insist on it so much that you can't move forward in the conversation.
Yes. That's a perfect way to say that. You can't move forward in the conversation. And so if we're going to talk about gaslighting or problems with communication, it's very hard to say, because there are some people who believe gaslighting is totally, completely intentional. They know exactly what they're doing, and they're doing it on purpose to confuse you. But if you lived with one of these people, you know that it's not always like that. Sometimes they really do seem to think that that's what happened. I mean, you know what I mean? And so it's like, and what I always tell people is, you can get bogged down in that, but the truth is it does not really matter, because whether they're doing it intentionally or whether they're not doing it intentionally, someone trying to continuously force you into this reality that does not match your actuality affects you the same way, it doesn't matter whether they're doing it on purpose or not.
We should also say that a person who is a narcissist can be simultaneously grandiose and covert.
Yes.
And that really changes the behavior pattern too, and makes it even more confusing to understand, because it's the same person who one day can be saying to you, I can go down there to the martial arts studio and beat all those guys. The next day will say, I'm terrible at martial arts. And I need you to tell me that I'm not.
No, that's absolutely right. And a lot of it is, this is somebody who is, first of all, this is a person who lives in a fiction. I mean, truly they do. That's what kind of like what you're saying, like psychosis light, where it's not maybe doesn't maybe fit the clinical parameters for delusion, but man, it's close. It's close. And so, the difference would be, for example, a person with schizophrenia, if they say to you, don't you see these black helicopters that are following me around? They see them. They see them. So if you say you don't, then you're lying, because what do you mean? They're there. I can see them. They're right there. A person with a really severe narcissistic pathology believes that they are probably there. They don't see them, but this is probably true, because I'm very important. So why wouldn't they be following me around? It doesn't technically fit the definition of a hallucination, and it really doesn't fit the definition of a delusion, because it's not a completely fixed belief. There are some days where they will tell you, I know black helicopters are not following me around. It's a lot of their, what seems like paranoia and delusions and things like that, they're mood dependent, and so, for example, if they're stressed out, you're going to see more of this paranoia, more of this, you're out to get me, you're trying to sabotage me, you did this to me, or I'm really amazing. I'm really awesome. You couldn't poke a hole in this ego, with a jackhammer if you tried. And that's all really mood dependent. And so what you're talking about is very similar to that. If on this day they're feeling really great about themselves, or they need to construct something to combat a lot of internal sort of aggression from their superego, from their subconscious, then you'll hear stuff like that. Well, I'm awesome. I could whoop everybody down there. They're not gonna be able to touch me. And then the very next day, the mood, or maybe even a little while later in the day, the mood has taken a nosedive because something triggered them. And so that's all forgotten. And now we're in a totally different space where that's not how it is.
Great. So I think, well, before we move on, what about overt abusiveness? So we talked about narcissists tend to be manipulative in the way that they communicate. They can have this, what I was calling psychosis light. What about just openly abusing, screaming, yelling, going into rages, that kind of thing? And sometimes being physically abusive. Are those characteristics of being around a narcissist as well?
They can be. I wouldn't want to lock it into saying 100% yes or no, because behavior is if you only look at behavior, it's an incomplete understanding. You know what I mean? Because pathological narcissism is about mindsets and thought processes and behavior. It's all of these things together. And actually, a podcast episode I did recently, I talked about, for example, a psychopathic person, someone who is predominantly psychopathic, could do some of the same behaviors that you see in narcissists who are not psychopathic, but their motive is very different. It's not the same. So, but yes, it is very, very common for there to be abuse in narcissistic relationships because, first of all, if you're manipulating somebody, that's abusing them. That's the first thing. That can be covert abuse, but it can also be really obvious too. And so, but whatever way it comes out, whether it's screaming and throwing tantrums or breaking things or attacking, this is all about somebody needing control over the situation, over the person, because narcissistic people are truly dependent on they cannot experience themselves except through the reality of other people, and so they're very dependent on people because of that. And if they're not able to create their own self-esteem or their own self-worth, that's what narcissistics supply. You are supplying their self-worth and their self-esteem to them. So they're sort of walking around really not being able to fulfill their own needs at all. And if you're not going to do that, then they will make you. And it's whatever way that this has to happen. It really is like a tantrum from a child, because if you won't give a child something, they melt down and have a big fit, because children don't understand about it's okay, we can wait for it. You're going to get it in 10 minutes or an hour. And for example, a little baby that has a cup of milk, then they spill their milk, then they cry and have a tantrum because they don't realize there's more milk. We're not thinking of it that way. All I know is I had something and now I don't have it anymore. So the more overt sort of manifestations of abuse usually come in those situations, whether somebody's covert or whether they're not. Because that's another thing, and I tell people all the time, if a narcissistic person has never been, as you were putting it, overtly abusive, it's because that they've never felt they've needed to. But if they do feel that way, then chances are very good that you will see it. So
you've already opened this door, but the next thing I wanted to talk about was kind of the inner dynamics of a narcissist, because on your podcast and YouTube videos, you probably focus on that more than almost anything, is sort of understanding what the narcissist is all about. And I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Les Carter. He also does lots of discussion of narcissism in his YouTube videos.
I've heard of him. I don't know if I've ever seen any.
His material is also very good. And he says that the primary characteristic of a narcissist, even I'd like to ask him, but it sounds like he's saying even more so than self-regard is an outsized need for control, and that control is the kind of the foundation of the narcissist's basic orientation toward the social world. So how would you describe the basic way that a narcissist thinks?
I would actually agree with that, and I would maybe go a little further as to say that the need for control is stemming from fear, because I really think that their orientation to the world is fear-based. And that is where the need for control is coming from. So because this is, going back to where they're kind of stuck in this way of being a child emotionally, or, the way that they sort of attempt to get things done, these immature abilities and mechanisms that they have. If someone feels powerless, if they believe they're powerless, or if they've been told they're powerless, blah, 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 depending on where we're going with that, then they're going to feel like they're really out of control of themselves, of their environment, of everything. And they're not going to feel that they can get their needs met. So the need for control would be predicated on fear. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely.
Yeah. So I would agree with that. I would just take it, I would just go a little farther with that and say that it's because of fear, because we often hear that the need for, their basic need is power and control. And when I'm looking at the situation, then I'm saying, why do you need power and control like that? That's coming from somewhere, because it's not a normal thing. And their behavior is not behavior that feels satisfied by this. No matter how much power and control they have, they still seem afraid.
Right. So in the myth of Narcissus, I heard someone point this out not too long ago, is that Narcissus did not fall in love with himself. He fell in love with his reflection. And one of the things you talk about in your podcasts is exactly that concept. And you brought it up just a minute ago when you talked about narcissistic supply, and that. Yeah, and even the podcast you released today about the cycle of narcissistic relationships that came up can you talk a little bit about sort of narcissists' view of relationships as a reflection of themselves?
I can, and I actually think it was me who said that in a podcast, because I was saying it's a very important distinction to make.
Well, it stuck with me. Yeah.
Narcissists. Yeah, because, and I'm glad, because you're exactly right. That is a very important thing. Narcissus did not fall in love with himself. He fell in love with his reflection. That's different. And that is essentially what we see with narcissistic relationships. Narcissistic people, and, I want to make sure I give the disclaimer that narcissism is a spectrum. And so there are some people who have really strong narcissistic traits. They are not pathologically narcissistic. What I'm talking about is people who are very seriously narcissistic. They have very strong narcissistic pathology. And so when someone has these kinds of issues, they are not able to create, maintain, or sustain their own sort of self-worth. They have one of the core sort of functions, one of the core sort of elements of narcissistic pathology is an unstable identity, sense of identity. And so that's one of the reasons why their ego is the way that it is, because if the ego is the reflection of your identity and your identity is unstable, so your ego is going to be way out of, everything's going to be fragmented with that. And so they're not able to create, maintain, or sustain their own self-worth. They need constant input from other people about them, essentially. And so we see this in very young children, and I mean really young children that are, 2 years old and under. that they are not able to form a self-concept. Little babies and small children really only have other esteem. That's what they build their self-esteem from. You know, how my caregivers interact with me, how they treat me, how they seem to feel about me tells me who I am. Am I good? Am I bad? Am I, you know? And so when this is inconsistent, I mean, you know, we really don't know exactly how it happens, but for whatever reason, they don't have the ability, and they're kind of stuck in that needing other people to mirror to them. They're stuck in other esteem mode, right? And so essentially you are a mirror that they are looking at, a reflection of themselves in, based on your feelings about them, your reactions to them, what you say about them, what you think about them. And that is your function in the relationship. And so what people find is this is sort of how the cycles go, you know, idealization, which is where everything is perfect. It's amazing. You're my soulmate. I never met anyone like you. I never felt like this before, you know, really intense, almost idolatry, where you're up on this pedestal, and you know, that's because you're reflecting that back to them. You're seeing them as perfect. They are in love with that reflection. And that's one of the reasons why they're giving you so much wonderful feedback. They probably really feel that way. You know what I mean? It's because, but those feelings aren't for you. They're for themselves.
Mm-hmm. About a year ago, you released a podcast about narcissism, and I think it's called The Tragedy of Perception. And that, I thought, really got to the heart of some very important ideas about narcissism. And I remember you said something like, I say tomato, you say tomato, and the narcissist says basketball.
Yes.
And it was an illustration about why relationship problems or difficulties relating to narcissists are not communication problems. They're perception problems. Can you describe the narcissist perception problem a little bit?
Well, narcissistic people do not have, they're not able to sort of regulate their emotions. And what you see is that all of their input, you know, whatever they receive, and also everything that they put out there, is sort of passing through this filter. And the filter is their emotion. So, and how they sort of see themselves. So if they're, for example, I'll give you just an example. If they're angry at you, or if you've been sort of painted black by them, because, you know, that's another thing that contributes to this, something called splitting, where they see you as either all good or all bad. If you've been sort of painted black in splitting, then anything you say and do is going to be passing through that perception, and it's all going to be turned into something bad. So it's like, let's say that you didn't know they've decided that you're bad today, or so you did something that triggered them, but you didn't realize it, because unfortunately that's very common. And you say, I made this sandwich, but I made 2 sandwiches and I really don't want this one. Would you like this one? You know, why would you do, spit in it? You know, it's that kind of thing. And so that is sort of how their perception works. Like, people will say all the time, they must be so smart. They're so calculating. How are they turning everything I'm saying around so quickly? Well, because they're not. That's how they're actually hearing it. They're actually experiencing it that way. They're not turning it around. This is how it's coming through. And so their perception is very affected. It's once again, like what we were talking about before, everything is mood dependent. I mean, it really, really is.
One of the things you often say too is that for the narcissist, feelings are facts. What do you mean by that?
Yes. Well, for example, we know feelings are not facts, because feelings they can be illogical. You know, sometimes you feel sad and you don't know why. Sometimes you feel bad and you don't know why. Sometimes you just wake up in a rotten mood. You don't really know what happened. You just are. You know, that's just how it is. It could be chemical, it could be hormonal. Maybe you had a bad dream you don't remember. It could be a lot of things, right? Maybe you're just in a bad mood. And so for narcissistic people, if they have a feeling that's the reality of the situation. Like, if I'm in a bad mood when I woke up, you obviously did something to me to make me be in a bad mood. And so that's why I'm in a bad mood. Like, their fact, it's this cyclical reasoning where it's like, I know that you're trying to hurt my feelings, and my proof of that is that my feelings feel hurt. And it's like, okay, but you don't understand. That doesn't prove anything. That doesn't prove that I was trying to hurt your feelings. And, you know, but that's, of course, a waste of time because they feel it. It's true. How can you, you know, and so the feelings are not only facts, they're the evidence that prove the fact. It's a very backward situation.
It seems to me, too, that the narcissist's perceptual difficulties are related to the narcissist's refusal to take responsibility for anything. So that because relationships are a system and that person cannot see or accept his role in the system, everything has to be explained by leaving out at least 50% of the picture.
Yeah. And not only that, but what they did doesn't matter because that didn't cause anything. That's not important. What you did. And you're exactly right, because if you're in an argument with a narcissistic person and they're relaying what happened, you'll notice, and this is probably what you're talking about, they leave out anything that they said preceding. You know, they make it sound like you just said this to me, you just did this to me for no reason. Mm-hmm. And it's because, first of all, they can't take responsibility for anything. But for many of them, it also seems like they really just don't remember that they did that. Probably because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I said. You know, this is not okay that you did this. And it's like, okay, but the reason why I called the police is because you punched me. Like, you know what I mean?
Right.
But no, you had me arrested. What kind of person are you? You just trying to get me thrown in jail. And it's like, do you not understand? You physically attacked me. You know what I mean? But they really don't get it. If you really cared about them, nothing they do is wrong. They don't really remember what they did. It doesn't matter anyway. I mean, this is really the mindset that you're dealing with. All that matters is what you did to them.
So the narcissist is the person who says, you walked out of the room while I was talking to you, and you say, well, of course I did, because you threw a flower pot at me. And they say, yes, that the real issue is that you left.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, like I always heard, well, if it wasn't that, it could have been anything. Like, okay, you know, yes, you're right. If you didn't throw a flower pot at me, I still would have left because I'm a terrible person. I don't listen to you. I understand, you know, and that's why, you know, one of my most popular videos is one called Stop Explaining to the Narcissist, because this is what you're dealing with. It doesn't matter what you say. A quote unquote normal person, you know, I hate using that word, but we have to make a demarcation.
A non-narcissist.
Yes, a non-narcissistic person would not even say anything about you leaving the room if they threw a flower pot at you, because they would understand why you left. They wouldn't say, how dare you walk away when I'm talking to you, because that would leave you open to say back to them, well, you threw something at me. You know, like I feel like most people probably would not do that, even if they didn't care, even just for self-preservation. They wouldn't say that, because then it would get brought up what they did wrong.
Right.
But narcissistic people just don't. And that's another way I think that you really can know this is not just a mean person who's being abusive, or this is not just a person who doesn't understand and doesn't care. This is, you know, they do so many things to sabotage themselves. And that's one of the way you really can understand this is more than just a behavioral problem or a communication problem. This is someone that really has a lot of challenges, like a lot of them, because they will do things, you know, they cut off their own nose to spite their face all the time. These, you know, probably the people who, and I, you know, sometimes people get upset when I say this, but probably no one is harmed by their narcissism more than they are. Mm-hmm. And that is saying so much when you consider how much they hurt other people.
Right.
I mean, it's unbelievable.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned your video about stop explaining to the narcissist, and that what I wanted to talk about a little bit was, what are the very common mistakes that people make when dealing with a narcissist? And obviously one of them is trying to explain. What else?
Well, in trying to explain, it's not, it's a mistake, but it's not really one that you could sort of foresee. You know what I mean? Because it's like you and I are having a conversation right now. And if you say to me, I don't understand what you're telling me, or you seem to not understand a concept that I'm relating, I would explain it more, right? Because that's what you do. But, and that's your natural inclination when someone sees like they don't get it, or they're telling you they don't understand, or their behavior seems to not fit with someone who understands. Your natural inclination is to keep explaining. And the reason why we say not to explain is because you're wasting your time. Mm-hmm. All it's doing is stressing you out, upsetting you, frustrating you, because not only does this person not want to believe you, but there's so much that would have to happen for them to be able to believe you. Like it's not even worth bothering, it's really not. And so another thing, that's really probably the biggest mistake. Another mistake is assuming that they don't understand because of their behavior. There comes a point where, especially if you've told somebody over and over and over, you have to start wondering if maybe the problem is not that they don't understand, but that they just don't care. For example, if someone steals money out of your wallet and you say to them, listen, I don't like you to take my money when I'm sleeping or when I went to the bathroom or whatever, right? Don't do that again, because that's a breach of trust. I don't like it. And a lot of times, right, because I'm just a common thief, right? And you get that kind of stuff. But then they do it again, and then they do it again, and it's like, okay, how many times are you going to have the conversation about that this is not okay? They know that you feel that way. They may not understand why it's wrong because they don't have good functioning empathy, but they don't need to understand that. All they need to know is that you don't like it, and they do know that.
Right.
They don't care. It's not. Having the money is more important to them than destroying the trust in your relationship or upsetting you. And that is where you really need to understand, that this person doesn't care. And one of the things I like in that too is like a small child, let's say a 3 or a 4-year-old, you tell them, okay, you cannot have don't take any cookies out of this cookie jar. You cannot have any cookies until after dinner. Now, if they take the cookies, they may not know why you don't want them to eat the cookies, like, the broader picture of why they're not allowed or why they shouldn't. But they don't need to know that. And they're still going to get, you're still going to say that they're going to get whatever is the repercussion for that, for taking them without asking, because they know that they weren't allowed, and that's all they need to know. Mm-hmm. So, you have to start trying. And so it's like the same with narcissistic people, that it doesn't matter whether they understand why it's wrong or not, because they know that it's you think it's not okay, and that's all that matters. They've very clearly demonstrated that they do not care. And so that is one of the bigger mistakes that people make, is not, whether through refusing or cognitive dissonance or being confused. There's a lot of stuff that goes into this, but not seeing things for what they really are. People's behavior speaks for itself, and we really need to let it.
Yeah. Is it possible, do you think, to set and maintain boundaries with a narcissist, somebody who takes the cookies every time you turn your back? Or even when you're standing there watching?
Yeah, when you're standing there watching and they put their hand right in the cookies and you're like, what are you doing? Oh, I'm not doing anything. You don't see anything. Okay. Right. Yes, I see you. Okay. It's like that old thing. Who am I going to believe? You or my lion eyes, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but it depends, I guess, on what you mean by maintaining boundaries. If the boundary is when someone disrespects me, they don't get to be in my life, then yes, you can maintain that. Right. But is it possible, is it going to be a relationship where you can somehow force a narcissist to respect your boundaries? Probably not, no. Because you can't, and that's one of the main sort of points of what I teach is you cannot control other people, because that's what a lot of this is about, trying to control the other person, not in a terrible way or anything. You're trying to stop them from doing terrible things, right? From abusing you or spending all the money and throwing the family into the poorhouse or whatever they're doing. But it's really important, and that's another one of the, I think, bigger mistakes or sort of misconceptions that people have, is that your behavior is somehow responsible for their behavior, or you can control their behavior through yours. This is not true. Mm-hmm. It's not true. If someone decides that they're not going to respect your boundaries, your feelings, what you're saying, what you want, then that's it. They have decided that, and there's nothing you can do to make them care or to make them want to do it.
Can narcissists change? Do they change?
Well, I guess it depends on how we define change, because their behavior sometimes can be different. But if I don't know if
can they become non-narcissists?
No, no. In order for that to happen, there are so many things that they need to learn, like you see. And so it's like, one of the analogies I use is, let's say that you have a small house and you want to build some additions onto it, right? Because these are the things that they would need to learn, these additions, the things that we all have learned, looking into yourself and sort of self-discovery and empathy and controlling your emotions and doing all these things that they should have already learned, but they did not. So those are the additions that you want to put onto the house. Whenever you go to put the additions onto the house, you realize the frame of this little small original house is maladaptive. It cannot be built onto, and it cannot support any structure that you would try to put on top of it. So what you would have to do is go in, take out this frame and replace it with one that will work without destroying the house. I don't know how you would do that.
Well, we are about out of time at this point, and I feel like we have just now scratched the surface. So maybe we'll have to do this again at some point in the future, but I don't want to leave people with no hope in terms of, we just ended with they're very unlikely to change. If someone wants to hear more from you or wants to work with you, can you tell everyone how they could find you?
Absolutely. They can find me on YouTube if you just type in The Little Shaman, Spotify, iTunes, all the big podcast aggregators. They can find my website, littleshaman.org, and that's how you can find links to all of my stuff. I have a lot of free tools on there for people who are recovering from this, for people who are going through it. If you want to speak with me one-on-one, you can do that through my website too. Great. Thanks again. You're very welcome. Thank you. Well, thank you for listening to this episode of the Dean Abbott Podcast. As always, feel free to find me on Twitter or to reach out via email at dean@deanabbott.com. Until next time, I wish you well and all the best in your attempts to build a more peaceful and quieter life.